Grade 8, Collection 1 Test. Directions. Read the following excerpt, then answer the questions that follow. From Geraldine Moore, the Poet, by Toni Cade Bambara. Geraldine paused at the corner to pull up her kneel socks. The rubber band she was using to hold them up made her legs itch. She dropped her books on the sidewalk while she gave a good scratch. But then she pulled the socks up again. 2 fingers poked right through one of the left one. "That stupid dog," she muttered to herself, grabbing her books and crossing against traffic. "First he chews up my big gym suit and gets me in trouble, and now my socks." Geraldine shifted her books to the other hand and kept muttering angrily to herself about Mrs. Watson's dog, which she minded 2 days a week for $1. She passed the hot dog man on the corner and waved. He shrugged as if to say business was hard. "Must be," she thought to herself. 3 guys before you had to pack it up and forget it. Nobody's got hot dog money around here. Geraldine turned down her street, wondering what her sister Anita would have for lunch. She was glad she didn't have to eat the free lunches in high school anymore. She was sick of the funny-looking tomato soup and the dried-out cheese sandwiches and those oranges that were more green than orange. When Geraldine's mother first took sick and went away, Geraldine had been on her own, except for when Miss Gladys next door came in on Thursdays and cleaned the apartment and made a meatloaf so that Geraldine could have dinner. But in those days, Geraldine never quite managed to get breakfast for herself, so she'd sit through social studies class scraping her feet to cover up the noise of her stomach growling. Now Anita, Geraldine's older sister, was living at home waiting for her husband to get out of the army. She usually had something good for lunch, chicken and dumplings if she managed to get up on time, or baked ham from the night before, and sweet potato bread. But even if there was only a hot dog and some baked beans, sometimes just a TV dinner, if those soap operas kept Anita glued to the TV set, anything was better than the noisy schoolroom lunchroom where the monitors kept pushing you into a straight line or rushing you to the tables. Anything was better than that. Geraldine was almost home when she stopped dead. Right outside her building was a pile of furniture and some boxes. There wasn't anything new. She'd seen people get put out in the street before. But this time, the ironing board looked familiar, and she recognized the big, ugly sofa standing on its arm, its underbelly showing the hole where Mrs. Watson's dog had gotten into it. Mrs. Gladys was sitting on the stoop, and she looked up, took off her glasses. "Well, Jerry," she said slowly, wiping her glasses on the hem of her dress, "looks like you'll be staying with me for a while." She looked at the men carrying out a big box and an old doll sticking up over the edge. "Anita's upstairs. Go on up there and grab your lunch." Geraldine stepped past the old woman and almost bumped into the superintendent. He took off his hat to wipe away the sweat. "Darn shame," he said to no one in particular. "Poor people sure got a hard row to hoe." "That's the truth," said Gladys, standing up on her hands and her hips to watch the men set the things on the sidewalk. Page 2. Upstairs, Geraldine went into the apartment and found Anita in the kitchen. "I don't know, Jerry," Anita said. "I just don't know what we're going to do. But everything's going to be all right as soon as Ma gets well." Anita's voice cracked as she set a bowl of soup before Geraldine. "What's this?" Geraldine said. "It's tomato soup, Jerry." Geraldine was about to say something, but when she looked up at her big sister, she saw how Anita's face was getting all twisted as she began to cry. That afternoon, Mr. Stern, the geometry teacher, started drawing cubes and cylinders on the board. Geraldine sat at her desk, adding up a column of figures in her notebook. The rent, the light, the gas bills, a new gym shoe, some socks. Maybe they would move somewhere else and they could have her own room. Geraldine turned the square and triangles into little houses in the country. "For your homework," Mr. Stern said as he turned his back to the class, "set up the problems this way." He wrote "given" in large letters and then gave the formula for the first problem. Then he wrote "to find" and listed 3 items they were to include in their answers. Geraldine started to raise her hand and ask what these squares and angles had to do with solving real problems, like the ones she had. Better not, she warned herself, and sat on her hands. Your big mouth got you into trouble last term. In hygiene class, Mrs. Potter kept saying that the body was a wonderful machine, and every time Geraldine looked up from her notebook, she would hear the same thing. "Right now, your body is manufacturing all the proteins and tissues and energy you will need to get through tomorrow." And Geraldine kept wondering how. How does my body know what I'll need when I don't even know what I'll need to get through tomorrow? And as she headed down to the hall in her next class, Geraldine remembered that she hadn't done the homework for English. Mrs. Scott had said to write a poem, and Geraldine had meant to do it at lunchtime. After all, there's nothing to it. A flower here, a raindrop there, moon, June, rose, nose. But the men carrying off all the furniture had made her forget. And now, put away your books, Mrs. Scott said, as Geraldine tried to scribble a poem quickly. Today, we can give King Arthur's knights a rest. Let's talk about poetry. Mrs. Scott moved up and down the aisles, talking about her favorite poems and reciting a line now and then. She got very excited whenever she passed a desk and could pick up a homework from a student who had remembered to do the assignment. A poem is your own special way of saying what you feel and what you see, she said, passing Geraldine's desk. Sometimes an idea takes the form of a picture, an image. Mrs. Scott went on, her lips moist. It was her favorite subject. For almost half an hour, Mrs. Scott stood at the front of the room reading poems and talking about the lives of great poets. Geraldine drew more houses and designs for curtains. So for those of you who haven't done your homework, try it now, Mrs. Scott said. Try expressing what it would be like to be alive in this glorious world. Oh, brother, Geraldine muttered to herself as Mrs. Scott moved up and down the aisles again, waving her hands and leaning over the student's shoulders, saying, "Oh, that's nice," or "Keep trying." Finally, she came to Geraldine's desk and stopped, looking down at her. "I can't write a poem," Geraldine said flatly, before she even realized she was going to speak at all. She said it very loudly, and the whole class looked up. "And why not?" Mrs. Scott said, looking hurt. "I can't write a poem, Miss Scott, because nothing lovely's ever happened in my life. I haven't seen a flower since Mother's Day, and the sun don't even shine on my side of the street. No robins come to sing on my windowsill." Third page. Geraldine swallowed hard. She thought about saying that her father doesn't even come to visit anymore, but changed her mind. "Just the rain comes," she went on, "and the bills come, and the men move out the furniture, and I'm sorry, but I can't write no pretty poem." Teddy Johnson leaned over and was about to giggle and crack the whole class up, but Miss Scott looked so serious that he changed his mind. "Well, you have just said the most poetic thing, Geraldine Moore," said Miss Scott. Her hands flew up to touch the silk scarf around her neck. "Nothing lovely has been happening in my life." She repeated it so quietly that everyone had to lean forward to hear. "Class," Mrs. Scott said very sadly, clearing her throat, "you have just heard the best poem you will ever hear." She went to the board and stood there for a long time staring at the chalk in her hand. "I would like for you all to copy it down," she said. And she wrote it, just as Geraldine had said, bad grammar and all. "Nothing lovely's been happening in my life. I haven't seen a flower since Mother's Day, and the sun don't even shine on my side of the street. No robins come and sing on my windowsill, just the rain comes and the bills come and the men move out our furniture. I'm sorry, but I just can't write no pretty poem." Mrs. Scott stopped writing, but she kept her back to the class for a long time, long after Geraldine had even closed her notebook. And even when the bell rang and everyone came over to smile at Geraldine or to tap her on the shoulder or to kid her about being the school poet, Geraldine waited for Miss Scott to put the chalk down and turn around. Finally, Geraldine stacked up her books and started to leave, and then she thought she heard a bit of a whimper, the way that Mrs. Watson's dog whimpered sometimes. And then she saw Mrs. Scott's shoulders shake just a little. Question number 1. Using paragraphs 1 and 2, what can you infer about Geraldine as a character? A, she likes taking her time walking to school, so she often pauses at the corner. B, she does not take care of her belongings, so she often has holes in her socks. C, she tries to make her belongings last, so she uses rubber bands to hold up her old socks. D, she enjoys caring for Mrs. Watson's dog, so she tries not to be angry when he ruins her clothes. Page 4. In paragraph 4, what does the phrase "nobody's got no hot dog money" mean? A, it means that people actually do have money for hot dogs. B, it means that people actually do have money, but they choose not to spend it on hot dogs. C, it means that people do not have money for food. Or D, it means that people do not have extra money to spare on entertainment or treats. 3. In paragraph 5, the author uses imagery of the school lunch to suggest that A, Geraldine wishes that she could continue eating the free lunches. B, Geraldine believes that the school is very generous. C, Geraldine thinks that the school lunches are unappetizing. D. Geraldine understands why the school lunches are free. 4. How does Geraldine's discovery of her furniture in paragraph 8 propel the action of the story? A. It provides the exposition by setting up the main conflict in Geraldine's home life. B. It continues the rising action by creating more problems in Geraldine's difficult home life. C. It begins the falling action by suggesting that Geraldine's problem with Mrs. Watson's dog is over. D. It introduces the resolution by promising that Geraldine's life will soon change. 5. Anita's reaction in paragraph 14 suggests that she thinks that A. her mother will not recover soon, B. that they should not stay with Miss Gladys, C. Geraldine will not like the soup she has prepared, D. that they should go and tell her mother what has happened. 6. What is the effect of the image of the tomato soup in paragraphs 14 through 17? A. Earlier tomato soup was a symbol of unappetizing food. Now it is one of the lunches that Geraldine looks forward to eating. B. Earlier tomato soup was just part of the free lunches in high school. Now it signals that money is scarce for Geraldine's family. C. Earlier tomato soup was something Geraldine was sick of eating, and now it signals that she's ready to try new foods. D. Earlier tomato soup was funny looking, and now it seems even more appealing to Geraldine. Page 5. 7. Which best summarizes the most important idea expressed in paragraphs 18 through 20? A. Mr. Stern's discussion of cubes and cylinders could have helped Geraldine solve her own problems. B. Mr. Stern was a good geometry teacher, but Geraldine did not like math, so she didn't pay attention. C. Geraldine's big mouth had gotten her into trouble before, so she did not speak in Mr. Stern's geometry class. D. Geraldine was too worried about her family's money problems to be concerned with Mr. Stern's geometry problems. Number 8. Which of the following lines of dialogue reveal how deeply Mrs. Scott loves poetry? A. Today we can give King Arthur's knight a rest. Let's talk about poetry. B. A poem is your own special way of saying what you feel and what you see. C. Sometimes an idea takes the form of a picture, an image. D. Try expressing what it's like to be alive in this glorious world. 9. From Geraldine's thoughts and words in paragraph 34, the reader can infer that A. Geraldine is comfortable describing all the problems in her life. B. She is inspired by her father, so she continues to describe her life. C. Geraldine's father has left the family and is not part of her life anymore. D. Geraldine's father is not part of why she cannot write a poem. 10. What decision does Geraldine make at the climax of the story? A. When Geraldine notices several holes in her socks, she decides to blame Mrs. Watson's dog and keeps walking. B. When Geraldine daydreams about Holmes in math class, she decides not to raise her hand. C. When Geraldine explains why she cannot write a poem, she decides to express her frustrations instead of continuing to keep them to herself. D. When Geraldine recognizes her furniture in the street, she decides to go upstairs to eat lunch. 11. What sentence best summarizes the plot of this story? A. A girl who is being cared for by her sister has to move in with a neighbor when her family is evicted. B. A girl has difficulty concentrating in school because her mother is ill and her family has been evicted. C. A girl whose family is having difficulty describes her hopelessness in a poetic manner that affects her teacher. D. A girl goes home for lunch to find out that her family has been evicted and her older sister is in tears. This is the end of part 1. Please go back to YouTube and find part 2 to continue.